this little demo, I'm going to show you how using different kinds of, two different kinds of salt can make a great texture, say for a stucco wall, or even maybe a rock wall or some other kind of a textured surface. So I've already got a base coat on here. I wanted to do that because I wanted you to see that you don't have to start with pure white paper. And actually something like this, if you need to, you can use something like this to get this a good background into the texture of a stucco wall. So now I'm going to change to an orangey color, sort of a vermilion, and I'm just going to put that right on top of this first layer. This I guess in a way this is glazing to make to get the different colors. But the yellow part underneath was just basically an underpainting. Okay, now you don't want the wall to be all the same color, so I'm just going to sort of swoop some of these other colors in through it before I put the salt on, and then you'll get different variations of the colors and lifting with the salt. Now what the salt does, if you put it into a wet pigment, and you have to let it sit. When it dries, it will lift, and it just looks like little sparkly things. It's also a good thing to use when you're trying to do snow, which we'll probably do that with that in a little bit. But to add texture to a stucco wall, and I've got two different kinds of salt. I've got table salt, and I've got a sort of a kosher or rock salt or something. If I have a small area, I'll probably use, or if I want small little areas that of texture, I'll use table salt. If I've got a bigger area and I want to be more dynamic with it, I'll use the kosher salt or the rock salt. This is one of those cases where you kind of need to let the paint soak in a little bit, and you can kind of see it has some shine on it. So we'll let that sit for just another few seconds. And I think it was Tony Van Hassel that said on a lot of these techniques where you're lifting or putting salt or things like that, he says, I found one thing, you either do it too soon or too late. So there is sort of a timing issue here, but hopefully we'll be able to show you what the outcome is. And depending on how far away from the paper, you'll get a different amount of texture. If you hold the salt way up here and put it on there, you might get a different look as opposed to holding it closer and concentrating it more in one area. So we'll see if that works in just a minute. You do have to let it dry before you know if it works or not. Now, the kosher salt should give us a little bit more texture. And let's see. Once again, we're just going to see if it's still got a little bit of a shine to it, so I may have put that on a little too soon. We may have to just forego that. If it's a lot of times the salt will actually dissolve if you do it too soon. So whistle a little tune, or get some clean water, or get you a cup of coffee. No, you probably won't have time to do that. Anyway, just drop the salt on there, and then hopefully it will give us a beautiful texture effect when it dries. If not, you just have to do it again. And that's how you add salt to a wash to make texture on a stucco wall. We'll have to let that dry before we see the results of it. Another way I like to add texture is to do things like Saran Wrap. So we've got things like wax paper, Saran Wrap, and bubble wrap. And each gives a different texture. We'll do this one, this will be like for Saran Wrap. So let me go ahead and pull that off. Okay. I use this sometimes if I'm doing I've done several lighthouses like in Maine, and a lot of times they'll be up on a high cliff, or they'll have some areas maybe that around the edge or the shore it's kind of washed away and you get some of the rock formations and so forth. And you know, you really don't want to have to go in and paint every bit of that. So this, if you've got a large, especially a large area, and you want to just depict that it is kind of a rocky shore, then you can use the Saran to give you that rock texture. And you won't have to paint it. You'll just have to maybe go back and lift a little bit, or you know, maybe do some line work in it or something. All right, we'll get some different colors in here so you kind of see the effect if it where it lifts and where it stays. And lighter colors obviously are probably not going to be as obvious as some of the darker colors. Let's put a little more paint in there, make it nice and rich. Okay. I take a piece of Saran Wrap, and you know, the piece you use needs to be whatever size your work area is. If you get a tiny little piece and you've got a big painting, it's not going to work. So you may have to do a long piece if it's a big painting, or at least have several pieces ready. So the idea is to just sort of randomly, if you will, lay this Saran Wrap in the paint right on top, and then you can see already that it will make some, where it touches the paint and the paper, it clings to it. It kind of makes a suction. You can actually kind of you know, manipulate it a little bit if you want to. But you put that on there, and then you take a big book, which I will do in a little bit, but I'll press it down, and you have to let it dry. Otherwise, if you lift it too soon, you know, the paint comes right up. It doesn't. The texture comes right up. It doesn't really work. Now, if you want to do bubble wrap or wax paper, I'll do the wax paper on this one. It's a similar thing, but you do get a different look. And I just sort of crush it. I don't really worry too much about it, you know, being a perfect piece of wax paper. The idea is just to have enough paint on here so that if you make the texture, it actually looks like something. Sometimes people try to do it and they just don't use enough paint. Okay. Now, I would use this not only for rocks, but sometimes I've used it in the background of something. Just for a little bit different look than maybe what you might normally paint. It's just kind of a fun thing to try. You can add it to maybe a flower pot or something, just some texture. So crinkle it, press it flat, and this will, and then you have to put a book over it and let it dry, and that will give you a different kind of texture than the, but you can kind of see how that might do. That almost looks like roots on a tree. If you had a tree by the bank of a river and you had some exposed roots underneath, this might be a good way to paint those, and you really wouldn't have to paint them. So you can think of all kinds of ways to use it. And then bubble wrap, I use it sometimes just for background texture, but I also use it sometimes for like grape clusters. If I did a few grape paintings, and I didn't want to paint every grape, so I did sort of just an underpainting, And where the grape clusters were going to be, I put more paint, and then I put the bubble wrap on it. And that sort of gave me different sizes of grapes. So let's see if we can do that. Actually, I guess I better put some grape color out here. And you know, you can control this any way you want to just by what areas you wet. Let's start with a little bit of that. And a little bit of this. And a little bit of blue and violet, maybe. Okay. So I've just sort of loosely drawn here a little cluster of grapes, and I'm just going to kind of wet that to just kind of give it the shape I want it. I do have a little paint in my brush, that's not going to hurt at this point. I'm going to make it a little bigger for the demo. Actually, if I were to do individual grapes, I would probably start in a similar fashion anyway, just with sort of an underpainting. A little yellow in there, right at the top. And then go to some of these warmer colors. And then down to what we think of as a good grape color. Now that's pretty random. So you're probably thinking, how in the world is that going to be a cluster of grapes? She's totally lost her mind. Okay. So we're going to let that sit just a minute. Let it soak in. So you can actually do this two ways. You could actually put the paint on the bubble wrap and press it into the paper, onto either wet or dry paper. But a fun way to do it too is just to press it into the wash, and then in a couple places you might want some smaller ones, so they might be either in the edge or sort of toward the back. You can actually see, I'll dip this in the paint so you'll see what happens if you dip it in the paint and then put it in the area that's dry. You can probably actually see what that texture is going to be. We'll do that there. And this, once again, you have to put it under a book and let it dry really good. If you lift it and try to move it around, you're probably not going to get the texture. So either have it big enough so that it covers the area that you have painted, so you don't have to move it. Or you may end up having to do it again. Now, I have some samples of some of the things that I did that I said we had to dry. So let me just put this aside. This is actually the Saran Wrap. You can see you can manipulate it any way you want to. You can make background trees, you can make texture on the cliffs of a shoreline, you can make it be all kinds of folds in cloth, or tablecloths or something like that. You can, if you think about it, you can find a place to use it, and it's just kind of a fun thing to do. Now this is the different bubble wraps. This is the larger bubble wrap, and this is the smaller bubble wrap. Once again, it's use your own imagination on a lot of it. This is actually part of the wax paper. I didn't have it as crinkled up here, so I didn't get all the texture, but down here I got a nice texture. This is actually a coffee filter that I put paint down and pressed crinkled the coffee filter up and crinkled it. So that gives you another another texture as well. Now you can see, let me go back to the salt, you can see what the salt is doing. As it dries, it sucks the paint up and it leaves little spots and stuff. So that's kind of the idea behind the salt, to lift the paint, but don't try to go in and brush it off until it's completely dry, or it'll smear and so forth.